Can the deaths of 40 refugees in a Mexico immigration detention center be attributed to America's immigration control system? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy in the context of the burning issues of the day. You can subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we have strived to make, I don't know, for 20 years or so, the best libertarian commentary page on the internet. We've got our website at fff.org. We've got our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which our co-host here, Richard Ebeling, contributes to every month. And we've got our YouTube channel. And I'm joined, as I am every week or most weeks, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you, to be back here with you, and to be spending a bit of time with our viewers and listeners whose willingness to listen to what we have to say and sort of watch in, we, of course, greatly appreciate.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. You know, Richard, one of the gratifying things about this work, and you were with me in the beginning when we started Future of Freedom Foundation, is that we don't just talk about libertarian issues in an esoteric sense. We try to tie them in with the burning issues of the day, so that people can see that there is a real direct relevance between principled libertarianism and what's going on in the world today. And we can see this right now with what's happened in Mexico. In Juarez, Mexico, there's been about 40 refugees there from Central America, from South America, that died in a fire. They're in a detention center where they were being held, and I think some 28 or 30 or more were injured in this fire. So it gives us an opportunity to revisit an issue that you and I have been addressing really the entire 33 years that the Future of Freedom Foundation has been operating. I forget what issue it was back in 1990, our first year of publication, but I think it was maybe the June issue. All the old issues are there on our website. And I think it was June where we addressed immigration. We just a few years after starting FFF, we came up with our book, The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. So we're not new to this issue. And, as you know, I grew up on the border. I spent half my life living on the border. And all my life, I've seen, there's our book, The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration, edited by Richard Ebeling and Jacob Hornberger. And that's one of the books that I'm really proud of, Richard, that we were addressing this issue as far back as 1990. And I've seen this immigration crisis all my life. I mean, it's especially when I was living down there on the border. It's a perpetual crisis. It never goes away. And perhaps most important, it comes with death. It's not just economic privation that socialism causes. And make no mistake about it, this is a socialist system, immigration controls. It's based on the socialist principle of central planning. The government decides how many immigrants are going to be permitted to come in, how many refugees, what their qualifications are going to be, how much allotted to each country. And so you're obviously going to have tremendous distortions that come with central planning. Ludwig von Mises called the results of central planning planned chaos. And that's what you have on the border. You've had it there for decades. I don't think there'd be any better term to use than planned chaos. And that's why all those refugees that got caught in this fire were there, that the U.S. government has a policy of not letting refugees come into the United States to submit their applications. They have to wait in Mexico. Well, Mexico is a very poor country. They can hardly handle their own populace, much less this huge influx of refugees that they're now having to house. And so this detention center was just tremendously overcrowded. And I don't know exactly how the fire got started, but the fact is that these people died because they were in an immigration detention center as a direct result of America's immigration controls. So I've seen this all my life. So I've seen the deaths in the backs of 18-wheelers, dying of asphyxiation, or dying of thirst on the drowning in the Rio Grande. I mean, dying of thirst crossing a desert in the Southwest, or dying of drowning in the Rio Grande, or dying because the Border Patrol's fired a bullet at the immigrant. Death comes with this system. And it's just amazing to me that there are still so many people that favor this system, knowing that it produces crisis, chaos, death, suffering, humiliation. I think there's this sense among people that they can still make it work, that there's this hope that there's some kind of comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, I love that term. That's the term that the mainstream media uses, that there's some comprehensive immigration reform that can really make this system work. It just doesn't occur to people that this is an inherently defective system. Socialism is an inherently defective system. It cannot be made to work. There's nothing anybody can do. And notice that whenever they do a reform, like this reform that required refugees to wait in Mexico, it sometimes makes the situation worse. And so you have all these deaths now. And so death comes with this system, along with crisis and chaos. And so I'm proud of that book. I'm proud of the fact that we have been advocating the only system that works, and that's liberty, the free markets, economic liberty specifically, free markets, open borders, the free movements of goods, services, and people across borders. This was our heritage, Richard, as Americans. We had a system of open immigration for over 100 years. It was a system that worked. It was a system that produced economic prosperity for tons of people. It saved people's lives. There was none of this chaos and crisis that has come with immigration socialism, and none of the deaths that have come with immigration socialism. People were just treated like regular human beings. It's a heritage that we really should be proud of, but unfortunately, so many Americans today who have placed their faith in socialism, not just on immigration, but on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, the whole welfare state concept. They put their faith in socialism, and they keep thinking socialism can be made to work. It will never work. I mean, all they're doing is just beating their heads up against the wall on thinking they're going to make socialism work. The only thing that works is economic liberty, free markets, the free movements of goods, services, and people. And oh, by the way, and this is important too, economic liberty is also the only system that is consistent with moral and religious principles. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. The immigration control system that we have today is the exact opposite of that religious edict. So when we see deaths like this, which of course people are lamenting, they always do when there's a death in the back of some tractor trailer of asphyxiation, or somebody's drowning, you know, the crocodile tears start and say, oh, this is terrible and so forth. But what we need to recognize is these deaths are a direct result of America's immigration control system. Without that system, these deaths would never have taken place. What do you think, Richard?
Well, to pick up on the historical aspects that you're bringing out, I think we need to remember that America, through all of its history, has been a country heavily based upon the idea of a nation of new members joining through free migration. Before the American Revolution, there would be people who would write home to their families in Europe. And this would be like in the 1750s, 1760s. And they would tell their friends, their relatives, that in America, it was an international community. Now remember, a much smaller population back then in colonial America, but there was always this idea that people from all over Europe, because that was the major place from which migration was coming, obviously, were there. So there was Dutch, and there were British, and there were French, and there were Swedes, and there were Germans. So already there was this idea of America as this place where people from different countries that might even view each other in antagonistic ways in the old country found ways to live peacefully and productively and harmoniously together in America. it's worth also recalling that this is talked about in the Declaration of Independence. All of us are familiar with the famous words that inspired so many people. Jefferson's words of, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And that's the reason why governments are formed among people, to have an agency that will their secure liberty rather than violate it. But the bulk of that rather short document, the Declaration of Independence, is the enumeration of the grievances that the American colonists had against the British government. And one of the grievances that's enumerated there is the attempt by the British government to limit migration to the American colonies. The people the colonists wanted more people to join them. More hands came, more work could be done, an intensified division of labor, a diversity of talents and skills, all of which would help to make this new people emerging in North America more strong and more prosperous and more culturally expansive than if they were narrowly limited to the people coming from one or two countries, and the numbers even from those areas being determined by the state. Throughout the 19th century, up until the last couple of decades or so, the fact is that America had no immigration restrictions. From 1840 to 1914, it is estimated that approximately 65 million people left Europe to find and make new homes in other parts of the world. Some went to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South America, Argentina, Brazil, and so on. But out of that 65 million people, it is estimated that about 35 million crossed the Atlantic to make their new homes in America. And they are our ancestors. Just as in more recent times, many of us have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who left the old country to make their home in America. It's not a cliche. We are a land of immigrants, and we've become even more so because of the ease of transportation and the changing global circumstances. Now people from literally all over the world come here. And that, again, a point to reiterate is that, well, what makes an American then? And I've mentioned it in some articles that we've published on these things before, in which if you become an American citizen, you take an oath of allegiance. There's no references to the English language or a particular religion or an ethnicity or a race. All you're asked to do is to end your allegiances to foreign potentates and principalities, and give an oath of allegiance to and defense of the Constitution of the United States. What is the Constitution of the United States? As I've often said, it's really an organizational chart. This is what the president does. This is what the Congress does. This is what the judicial system does. Why take an oath of allegiance? In fact, to risk your life in defense of this for an organizational chart? Because the Constitution was meant to be the institutional framework, the structure, to exemplify a government and a society based upon those principles of the Declaration of Independence. So in giving an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, you are giving an oath in spirit to the idea of individual liberty, the right of personal freedom, the right to be guided by your own purposes as an individual, and to associate with your fellow human beings on the basis of voluntary, peaceful agreement and exchange, not through force, coercion, or to be pigeonholed as categories of collective tribes, as opposed to distinct individuals, each with their own dignity and humanity. That is what America was founded on, these profound principles. And well, did that mean that there were not ethnic tensions? Of course. In the 19th century, you could read about these people when the waves of the Irish came, and then the Germans, and then the Italians, and then the Jews, and then constantly those who had been here earlier said, how can we ever integrate the Germans or the Irish or the Italians or the Poles or the Russian Jews? Oh, they're so different, their language, oh, their religion. But who are we? We are the fortunate beneficiaries, the descendants of all of those earlier generations who came together in this melting pot. I ask my students often in my classes, well, that's an interesting last name. Do you know the origin of it? In other words, what part of the world? Do you know when your ancestors, grandparents, or great-grandparents came to the United States, or why? Most of them don't know, because that's all been lost in the melting pot. It doesn't matter where you came from, your ancestors, the reasons, the circumstances, all of it came together and blended into a new and special people, the Americans. And those Americans did, through a great part of their history, exemplify those ideals of freedom and liberty and voluntary association, and government to be a limited partner in this, to act as the policeman and the law court and the adjudicator of legitimate disputes that people will have, but not the redistributor of wealth, not the regulator or planner of economic and social affairs, not to be the paternalist who decides how we're going to live and for what purposes and in what relationships with others. That is what America has been. We should be proud of that. And we can continue to have that if we just recognize that the ideal of America was free men, free exchange of goods, free exchange of ideas, and free exchange of people from one place in the world to another.
Yeah, I find it interesting that you mentioned the Declaration of Independence in this context, because we celebrate the Declaration of Independence every 4th of July, but how many people really give thought to the profundity of what Jefferson was talking about? I mean, this notion that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are God-given rights. They precede government. Nobody's got to be grateful to the government for these rights, that they are God-given, their natural rights. That was a revolutionary notion. It was always accepted throughout the ages that you belong to the king, you belong to the government. Whatever the government wanted you to do, you did. If they wanted to take your property, that was just the way it was. If they wanted to conscript you and force you to go fight in some foreign war, that's just the way it was. Jefferson is saying, no, that you have a right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these are fundamental, natural, God-given rights that no government can take away. And he's saying that not just as an American, because obviously they were just revolting. The Declaration was the announcement that we're seceding from the British Empire here. He's saying that every single person in life is endowed with these rights. So that means foreigners. And that's what I'm wondering, whether how many people really give thought to that it's not just us Americans. All these immigrants, all these foreigners are endowed with these fundamental God-given natural rights that no government, including the U.S. government, can legitimately interfere with. Now, what's life? Life is encompasses the ability to sustain your life through labor. God has endowed you with certain talents, abilities, work ethic, or whatever, but it's all designed so that you can sustain your life by providing goods and services to other people that will enable you to eat, because you can't survive without food. And so life obviously encompasses the right to sustain your life through labor. And liberty encompasses the ability to go work for somebody who's willing to hire you, to enter into exchanges with others. That's what's called economic liberty. The pursuit of happiness, that's, obviously encompasses a lot, making choices in your life that bring you happiness, which obviously includes crossing a state border and going from one state to another state, moving, visiting, touring, vacationing. The same principle applies to an international border. It's just an artificial line. The crossing of a border doesn't violate anybody's rights at an established crossing point any more than the crossing of the border between Maryland and Virginia violates anyone's rights. So when we think in these kind of terms, we see how this radical concept goes all the way up through the 19th century. They didn't think in terms of having immigration controls, because for our American ancestors, this was just natural. Now, we know there were some big exceptions to these principles, like slavery and tariffs and so forth. But in the overall context, most people had really unusual lives, Richard, throughout the 19th century. No income tax, no Social Security, no Medicare, no immigration controls, no Federal Reserve, no paper money, no drug war, no gun control. These immigrants were flooding American shores to get wealthy, to better their lives. This is the way they were pursuing happiness. And one of the most wonderful things that came out of this is that Statue of Liberty. I mean, the French said, here is a gift because your society is so different. And it was different. And then that poem by Emma Lazarus is just beautiful. I mean, when I first read that poem, it was like, wow. Because today, the immigration planners say we only need well-qualified people. We want college-educated people, wealthy people. That's not what that poem says on the Statue of Liberty. It says, give me your trash, your deplorables, your wretched refuse of your teeming shore, breathing, trying to breathe freedom and so forth. I mean, it's like, let the market make these decisions. Let anybody who wants to come to better their lives. And in fact, they bettered the lives of the American people. What our ancestors proved is that a system of open immigration improved your own standard of living through the division of labor. So the standard of living of the American people by the time 1900 rolls around is soaring, skyrocketing compared to the rest of the world. And a big factor of that was not just solid money, gold and silver coins, no income tax, no welfare state, no warfare state, but also open immigration.
Yeah, I think we need to appreciate more the distinction you made, but this idea of this universality. We often hear people refer to how in other places in the world, basic human rights are violated. Think of the people in North Korea. It's basically a huge, prison camp with a tyrant who's quite willing to execute not only political people around him, but even relatives if they seem out of line. The brutality of that system for even giving a wrong look. And when we look at the society and we abhor it, what do we often say? And this is said by many people. Well, isn't this a violation of their basic human rights, even if you're a person in North Korea? What does it mean? That means that the idea that each individual has certain inherent rights to their life, their liberty, to their freedom of conscience, their freedom of speech, their freedom of movement, if nothing else within their own country, is something that isn't unique to if you're born in the United States or Great Britain or France. No. This is something that we presume, we take for granted, we premise is true for each and every human being on the entire planet. So to say that certain rights belong to Americans, these are rights at the most fundamental level that are presumed to be universal, ecumenical, and belonging to each and every person anywhere. And unless one fully appreciates that, one does not understand what we're about. And one other historical point, you were saying, traveling, here, there, and everywhere. This is a starkly new phenomenon in human history. Before the modern centuries, in the Middle Ages, the lord of the manor not only owned the land, he not only owned the tools and equipment on the land, he did not only own the livestock on the land and any crops that grew on it, he owned the serfs. They worked his land as his property, in the sense that if a lord of the manor owned several of these estates and he decided to sell one of them for whatever the reasons, maybe he just needed money, but whatever the reasons, to sell one of his manors, one of his properties, to another nobleman, that nobleman not only gained by this process the land, the physical assets, the livestock, etc. He acquired, in this act of exchange, the serfs working on the land, and they were tied to the land. If you attempted to leave the land, you would be pursued. That is why it used to be said about the Middle Ages, and in the Middle Ages, in city air you breathe free. In city air you breathe free. What did that mean? It meant that if a serf escaped from a manor and he got to a town and could live within the walls of the town for more than a year and a day, he was now a free man. He was no longer under the obligation of being viewed as a property that had to work on that lord's manor. So the idea that you could have freedom of movement, freedom of occupation, freedom of speech, any of these, was a unique and special phenomena of which the new American colonies and certainly an independent nation exemplified and was hailed as a model for the rest of the world. When the comment was made about American exceptionalism, which is a loaded term in many ways today, what was first meant by American exceptionalism to begin with is that there was a land that had turned its back on the ways of the old world. You were not tied to the lord of the manor. You were not restricted in what you could say. Your religion was not determined for you by the king or the prince. You were a free individual to live your life peacefully and honestly as you chose, pursuing your own values, your own purposes, your own meanings, and your associations with others would be based upon voluntary exchange and freedom of contract that was mutually beneficial, with no man forced to work for another against his will and be deprived from the proper sense of the fruit of his labors.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. That the United States really was unique in the terms of this open immigration system, free movements of people. Now, a lot of people probably don't realize that another country in the Western Hemisphere copied America, and that was Argentina. Before Perón took power, it was around the early 1900s that they adopted a principle of open immigration. They essentially copied the U.S. Constitution: very low taxes, low regulations, a free enterprise system. They were among the most prosperous nations in the world as a result, with a system of open immigration. And then, of course, Perón comes in and everything changes, and that's what happened here. Everything changes. By the time the Franklin Roosevelt administration comes in, immigration controls have now become a fortified part of American life, which contributes to the Holocaust. That when Hitler was willing to let German Jews escape, all the other countries said, no, 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 we're not going to take them. And the United States said, we're not going to take them either. Well, if they had continued the system of open immigration that America had been founded on, that had lasted for 100 years or more, Roosevelt couldn't have done anything about it. Those Jews would have been free to come to the United States. I think it's also important to point out that this tragedy in Mexico is not the only time this has happened. It's happened any number of times. Just a few weeks ago, I read that some rickety boat in Europe sunk, killing dozens of immigrants because, again, they have immigration controls. They've always had there in Europe. People have to take these rickety boats if they're trying to save their lives, escape tyranny or oppression. In the case of open borders, they wouldn't be taking these rickety boats. They wouldn't be sitting in these detention centers. They wouldn't be swimming across the Rio Grande. And finally, Richard, let me just say that open immigration works. Open borders works. That if you eliminated immigration controls today, that crisis on the border would be over immediately, because those flows of people would now become normal. You wouldn't even know that the person you were dealing with was a foreign citizen. I mean, there's an estimated 10 million illegal immigrants today. Do you know who they are? When you go to McDonald's and you hear somebody in the back speaking Spanish, do you know whether they're here legally? Do you care? No, of course not. Nobody cares on an individual basis. And that's what happens with open immigration. You would never know that the person you're dealing with is a Mexican citizen, a Salvadorian, or what. It wouldn't matter. All that would matter is you're dealing with human beings. It's the only system that works, Richard, the free market. It's the only system that's consistent with moral and religious values.
If I can make sort of analogy, suppose that states could have immigration borders, and people wanted to leave California because of tax oppression, regulatory restrictions, lack of freedom of opportunity, woke tyranny in terms of the workplace and what you could say and how you could associate with people. And they wanted to leave California to escape the social and economic oppression. And they wanted to come to Texas or Florida. And no, the state governments of Texas and Florida had immigration barriers, and they'd only let in those that they had vetted, while hundreds, maybe thousands, were stuck in immigration camps in Oklahoma and New Mexico or Georgia or Mississippi. Oh, just let us in. We want to be free and work in Texas and Florida. Oh no, we have to decide who comes in and how many. You might be a drug dealer from California. We know what those hippie descendants are like. And oh, you might want to mooch off government programs in Texas and Florida. Oh no. And then people are attempting to cross the border from, let's say, Georgia to Florida, helped by coyotes, and they die in some area along the border. Oh, it's a tragedy, but we can't let everybody into Florida. I mean, I know that sounds so sarcastic and absurd, but is it really absurd? Because the logic of the principle is exactly the same. And all because some people wanted to escape from more statist California to live freer lives in Texas and Florida.
I don't think your analogy is absurd at all. I think it's absolutely realistic. The reason that nobody questions this system of open borders domestically, it's really the largest open border system geographically, I think, in history. And the reason nobody questions this is because we all were born and raised under this system. But if we had had a system of immigration controls where each state could establish controls and we had border guards to protect us from the terrorists and the murderers coming in from other states and so forth. Today, if you and I were to propose a system of open borders domestically between the states, people would go crazy. Are you guys nuts? Oh my gosh, are you open borders between, let anybody from Maryland come into Virginia? Are you crazy? Unrestricted? But it's because we've been born and raised under this concept of liberty, freedom of movements. It's like no big deal. Nobody gives it a second thought. If we had been born and raised under America's heritage of open immigration that lasted 100 years, nobody would think twice about it. It's because we've all been born and raised under immigration socialism that people think, oh, there can't be any other way. This system, we're saddled with this system no matter how much death and destruction it brings. And I think I should mention also that it comes with the destruction of liberty. There's an entire immigration police state along the border in the Southwest. Highway checkpoints, roving border patrol checkpoints, warrantless searches of ranches and farms, just like in a totalitarian country. This is what comes. And when you suggest to somebody, let's get rid of the system, let's have the same system like we do domestically. Oh my gosh, oh, you would let everybody in. Oh, no, we can't do that. It's because that's what happens, Richard, when you born and raised under this kind of system. You don't question it, you just accept it.
Right. And you see the point is that was I was trying to draw and you're reinforcing is that the fact is there are no controls preventing both who and the numbers of people who choose to move from one state or another. Some states have grown significantly in population because of people escaping for one reason or another from particularly heavy regulatory jurisdictions. Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, California. There have been huge influxes into states like Florida or here where I am in South Carolina or Texas. And yet any number can leave the states in which they've been born or have been living prior to this and to move into any other state with no concerns, no fears. How many are coming? Are we going to have enough housing for them? Who's going to pick up their garbage? We don't even think in those terms because we take for granted that as within the United States, people have freedom of movement, and these then work themselves out and sort themselves out by themselves. I know the government is big in the welfare state issue, but predominantly still in America, these things sort themselves out by themselves. How so? You want to go from California to Texas or to Florida or to South Carolina? Do we worry about government housing? No, you just enter the market and there's more people. So some house prices go up, others decrease. It's attractive to build more types of houses, condos, single standing, apartment complexes. I've seen this just in South Carolina in the almost 10 years that I've been here in the greater Charleston area. In the part of the greater Charleston area, Mount Pleasant, where I live, the population has exploded. All these subdivisions that have been built, and nobody worries about that. Oh, you complain about there's more congestion on the government roads, to get to work and everything. But in general, it has enhanced the community. More customers, more potential customers means an intensity of the division of labor in restaurants, boutique shops, specialty items. big marketing stores that otherwise wouldn't be there if there wasn't sort of a minimum population from which they could draw their clientele. All of this has benefited the people of South Carolina in general from this way. In spite of the complaining about, it's more congestion on the roads and stuff, in general, it's been considered a boon to the society. So these are all the benefits that we take for granted if people are just left alone.
Yeah, the free market is a great regulator. As prices of an area start going up, people think, up, that area is getting a little too expensive. I need to look for another area. But it also reminds me of what Sheldon Richmond once said, that the public sector, like public schools, the welfare state, the government roads that you mentioned, that's the only sector that complains about too many customers. Everybody else welcomes new customers, but not the public sector. They're like a burden.
Yes. What if there are people coming in and need to go to government schools, or we're going to require more mail deliveries, or any of these things? Oh, how can we handle this burden? Too many kids can, do you think Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or any of the other more regional chains of supermarkets, oh gosh, how are we going to handle all these customers who need to eat and want food? My God, we need to get a bigger space. We're going to have more people who want to buy our produce and canned goods and meats and eggs. They view it. Do you think with full private education, oh, look at all these kids that need to go to school because of the influx of families. My God, we can get a bigger building and hire more teachers and get more revenue by offering educational opportunities to a growing student population. The mindset is totally different with the marketplace. More people are opportunities, not burdens.
Right. Okay. On that fine note, we're going to wrap things up. We're about out of time. We got overtime. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your great support of FFF. Richard, I greatly enjoyed this conversation, as I always do with you, and look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.